Well, thanks so much for being willing to speak with our Dyslexic Advantage community. As we had spoken together, I came across your book, Dyslexia Toolkit, and I thought it was interesting, your discussion about audiobooks.
Audiobooks turned out to be the most powerful tool I had in my toolkit. And I think the pushback that you've seen and I've seen across the board from just lots and lots of educators is that they feel like if kids listen to audiobooks, they won't put in the effort to read if it's hard for them. What I found in actual practice and what you actually showed research for in that first edition of Dyslexic Advantage is that the opposite happens. If the child is allowed to use audiobooks to up their game as far as their understanding of literature and syntax and the English language or whatever language they're using, then that student is more motivated to learn to read. They put in more effort, and in fact, comprehension improves dramatically. So just an audiobook is a great tool. What I found is that if you pair audiobooks with tracking, so you have the student listening and looking at the text at the same time, but not trying to do that multiple things at once where they have to try to vocalize words, sound out words, and all of that. If they're just watching the words and they're hearing the words, this amazing thing happens. And what it is I tell the kids, the words are going to go in your ears and your eyes at the same time, and they're going to get locked in your brain. And that's a simplistic way of saying dual processing, which is what Dr. Matthew Schneps talks about in his research, ongoing research, as I know you've been following. So it's powerful stuff. And I've used it with probably hundreds of students with dyslexia with tremendous success.
Now, it doesn't necessarily mean if a parent reads to their child that we should just switch them to audiobooks and remove parents reading. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely not. And in fact, my own dyslexic daughter learned to read with the 10,000 hours on the couch next to mom. We enjoyed that time, me reading out loud, her tracking along. So that was maybe my first successful student right there.
That's great.
And yeah, if there's a mom, a dad, an uncle, a brother, a sister who's willing to put in those hours and enjoys it so that both the reader and the student are enjoying it, then I think that's even more powerful than an audiobook.
Yeah. And not either or too, right? Because a lot of cases it's that first steps for independence, which is so enjoyable. And
exactly.
right. So I mean, so it's just the idea of, okay, I'm going to go do my reading now, and then it doesn't rely on another person. And so if you get curious about something, you can keep listening, and reading along and doing all that good stuff. So I think that's terrific, because sometimes in the school system, I think there's a lot of worry about audiobooks, and a lot of people don't realize, for instance, if they qualify for the Bookshare resources, which are tremendous because they are free. And I think you mentioned you like the VoiceStream Reader app. I certainly love the VoiceStream Reader app. I mean, these are really good voices, and getting even better. I mean, they're pretty phenomenal, I think, in terms of where we started off with robotic voices. They're so much better now, so that it can help tremendously. And then once you become a great ear reader, you can actually even prefer that over, even when you become a semi-fluent reader, you may still prefer audiobooks because you can tune your ear and listen quite fast. So I think that's
huge. Being able to speed up the audio. My students who are high schoolers or college students, that's that's a game changer for them. If they can listen to the book at a rapid rate, and there again, Dr. Matthew Snaps kind of pioneered that idea, used it for himself, and then talked with Winston Chen about Voice Dream Reader, so that's part of Voice Dream Reader, which I love. And I find my high school students especially just absolutely, they keep speeding it up until they're at about 600 words a minute before they're happy with it, because they can get through so much material and they actually understand it better. And I've heard teachers say, well, how can they understand it at that speed? Well, they can. And I'm not really surprised, because I've known a few blind students who do the same thing. They speed up their audio. But I see kids using it all the time, very, very successfully.
That's great. Now,
So,
can you tell me a little bit about, some example students where you've seen their progression, and what sort of things goes on? Maybe this is a nice opportunity, because there are some people who are saying, well, I know the school's trying to help. I know I'm trying to help, but what additional things can a tutor do? Do you have any?
yeah, let's talk about some examples. I think I'll start with a very young student who actually probably wasn't dyslexic. He had CP, so his cerebral palsy made him unable to speak. Cute little guy, about 6 years old.
Could we do a dyslexic, since it's a dyslexic community, it would be really helpful to just have an example from a dyslexic student, no matter what age.
Okay. Well, let's see. I'm thinking of a little gal who was 12 years old, and she came to me unable to read. She sound out words, and she had several years of Orton Gillingham training, so she could sound out words, but she couldn't sound them out fast enough to make sense of her 7th grade level reading material. So she was really struggling. I also noticed she was attached to her phone. So we used her phone to pull up the text that she needed to read and to pair text with audio. And luckily, she was quite good at the technology and was quickly able to do this. And her grades went from C's and D's to straight A's in 1 quarter. Wow. Just because she had access to the material. And that made her feel so successful. For her, that was terribly important.
So that was in some cases, it's not what people think, like the tutor's going to, necessarily start right back at, take a curriculum and start working on decoding. A lot of times it might be they have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you're sort of looking more like workflow and troubleshooting the school experience. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Most of the students I worked with came to me after already having extensive tutoring.
Interesting.
In sounding out words, multisensory phonics, such as Orton Gillingham or one of the similar programs. So most of my students had already had 2 to 3 years of intensive work, either privately or in a pull-out school session. And they still weren't reading. And that's why they came to me, is because the parents were looking for some other alternative answers. So those were the students I tended to work with. One good example, a young man who was actually 16 when I saw him first. And he'd had 10 years of tutoring. His parents were quite well-to-do, and they were able to afford that much tutoring. But he was extremely frustrated. And what I realized was he could sound out words perfectly. He had mastered that skill. But as he said, I can't do it fast enough, because by the time I get to the end of the sentence, I've forgotten what it meant. And there's so much reading in high school, I can't keep up. So I just used the audiobooks as a way for him to get around that bottleneck. And it was beautiful. Within 6 months, he went from testing at 4th grade reading level to testing at 12th grade reading level. And that's because he quit trying to sound out the words, and he was starting to use that pattern recognition part of the brain that you talk about in Dyslexic Advantage to recognize words and phrases. And he was doing it so fast and so accurately that it upped his testable reading level that much. I think that all that work he put in for 10 years probably paid off, but it was probably overkill. In other words,
That might be a little controversial with some people. I mean, I do agree that we have seen students. I mean, it's hard to have strong statements about students that we haven't seen before, because, it's the human diversity issue, but, certainly we've tested students, we've spoken with adult dyslexics who are working in very high powered, actually reading intensive fields. And it's true that having the combination of both, of being able to decode on the basis of sounding out and phonetics, but also developing the shape recognition for more speeded reading, which is often easier, can lead to problems if you don't have the decoding, right? So that's why that piece is there. But it's definitely a helpful strategy. And sometimes, when we've spoken to, for instance, dyslexic lawyers, they say, if I have a contract or something like that, I realize that I can make substitutions. I might listen to it, I might just have my technology read it to me, but then I'll actually read it several times, and I'll read it fast, but I know I'll skip it. But when I keep reading it, I know that I'll read it all and notice every single word. And, it's whatever seems to work for you for accuracy. I mean, people develop their workarounds for a good reason. There's some things where they know that they've got a gap, and this is where I'll have a mistake. But the ones who are, sometimes people call them over preparers, they're really metacognitive. They know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, and their workarounds will try to fill in the gaps for weaknesses. And I just think it's better for outside professionals to recognize the fact that individuals may have their own fit, and it may not be what you necessarily think. And I think that's right. I think that sometimes you'll get some proponents of schools. I don't know that they've met enough of the exceptions and people to be able to say these things, because otherwise they wouldn't say them, right? When people tell you this is how I do it and it fits me best, I mean, I think, from the medical profession as a doctor, I know that there are a lot of mistakes that occur when doctors don't really listen to what their patients are saying. I mean, it's just, it's just hard to know everything, and just having that openness to really understand that these very intelligent people can also come to the conclusions that are very different from, a very well-developed curriculum. And I that's a nice story to share, because I think that's a perfect example where maybe he was waiting a long time. I won't necessarily say that 10 years were a mistake, because he might be really good at decoding and it might have helped his spelling and things like that. But he was also missing something that the curriculum lacked, and there are a few curricula who will put assistive technology in there, but it's there. And if you wanted to, if you see the emotional toll, as well as the academic one, you really hold people back when they can't access the information. And they don't train their tracking, like, as you say, they're not able to kind of do that because they haven't been doing it, because sometimes we'll get someone who's just pure audio. It's like, I'm giving up on reading. I'm just going to be an ear reader, and sometimes that, sometimes that might fit for a person, but I don't know if they haven't ever tried, that might be a mistake, because there's a million places. If you're driving and you have to read a sign that's coming up on the freeway, there's a lot of situations now. Sometimes you might have a GPS to say to you, but you're going to find something where that delay and not being able to pick up something and actually read in visually is just is a trouble. Is presents a problem. And so, if you're looking at a sign at a museum, I mean, there's a lot of just different situations where it would be good to also use both if you can. Now, I understand if people have been at it for years and years and years and they've got a visual problem, maybe not, but I would say the overwhelming majority of people can really become quite good at both. And in this situation where it's like you're trying to get on, it's like one of those subways. You're trying to get on the subway, it's like, and there's this certain speed of flow and things like that. And if you really, if you can't get on at all, but like for instance, if you want to get there, it's taking off a certain time and you cannot get there in time, you might want to run on the moving walkway because it'll help get you there. The key is to not sit there in class going, I have no idea what they're talking about. And that aspect of it, the accessibility of classrooms is extremely uneven. There are some teachers who really care about the issue and really devote a lot of time to it, but they often don't get funding. They don't get a lot of training. And so there are a lot of classrooms that are very inaccessible, and parents, teachers, students don't know what to ask for. So,
Right.
I think it's a great thing to bring up examples like this because it really is a tremendous issue. And there are a lot of people out there suffering in silence. Sometimes they say, well, if you don't know what's going on, just ask a question. You can't do that. You'd be asking a question every other sentence. And it's too much of a burden on the student. Then the other students are wondering, why are you asking so many questions? I mean, that aspect of it is, we have to really, as a society, we've got to think a lot more consciously about accessibility in the classroom. And, sometimes in some of the strong school districts, they designate kind of an accessibility person, assistive technology person, who tries to go through and be kind of like this master coordinator for the other teachers. And that's a good way to do it. Often, you need one for every classroom. The problem is that they're really stretched thin. But, just to say that there's a lot of customization, some people will look at voice stream reader and say, oh, there's so many controls and buttons. It's too much for me. But, I would say if that's the case, you try that, just hang in there and, maybe try to find somebody else who can, help you through it, walk you through it, and that would just go a long way because the payoff is tremendous. And we've certainly seen people who become, from non-readers, and basically there's a lot of life that you can live without reading, to ones who are just compulsively, this is like making up for lost time. All they want to do is like, listen to, read along, couple books a week. I mean, they really become voracious learners that way. And if someone wants to be like that, I mean, it's a wonderful thing, like you did with your students. Wonderful thing to connect them with a way to do it. And then the beautiful thing is that it doesn't get them out of something. They actually get better at it. I mean, that's the beauty of it.
That's the key that's often missing in the discussions I have with teachers is they think that we're bypassing the reading, and we're not.
Totally.
Especially if that student is tracking even part of it. I don't tell the students, oh, you have to track every word you're listening to. I tell them to start with 5 minutes, track for 5 minutes where your eyes are on the word that you're hearing. And that's so much easier, like with Voice Stream Reader or some of the other apps that highlight what's being spoken.
True.
But that's hard work for a dyslexic to keep their eyes on the words that they're hearing. Is very hard work. So I tell them, start with 5 minutes, start with 3 minutes if that's where you want to start. And then bump it up just a little bit every week. Then that's fine. Just do it every day. That's a key element, is do it every day. Just a little bit. And all learning works that way. If you practice a little bit every day, it's much better than practicing for 2 hours on the weekend. So I just have them do a little bit every day, keep bumping it up. And if they listen to the rest of the book while they're running or working or doing their housework or whatever, fine, doesn't matter. You're still getting that language input. And what happens is just so beautiful. It reminds me, one of my students was a 17-year-old cowboy. I'm in Colorado and we have real cowboys still. And he had had 3 years of tutoring. He could sound out words. He knew all the rules. He was very bright, but he just still wasn't reading. It just not at all. And as far as comprehension goes. And so I didn't have long with him. I only had like 3 sessions with him because he was going to take off on another job up to Wyoming. So I went, okay, you've got an iPad. You can access books that you can look at. I taught him how to track in those 3 sessions, listen to it, see it at the same time. And why don't you just take that with you and check out whatever books you want and see what you can do. And I told him, I'd recommend choosing very easy books at first, so the tracking is easy. Well, he ignored that advice. And I saw him 6 months later. He stopped by to see me and he was so elated. He goes, that Shakespeare dude, he is so cool. I've always wondered what people were talking about. And I said, you've got to be kidding. You didn't check out Shakespeare. And he goes, oh, yes, I did. And he goes, it was very cool because I could be in the bunkhouse at night with my headphones and I could be tracking, listening to Shakespeare, finding out what people have been talking about all this time that I had no clue about. And all the guys thought I was just listening to music or something.
It's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
And
Yeah,
so he
I love
he
it.
kept using that technology then to read mechanics textbooks, novels, all
Mm.
kinds of stuff that he'd missed out on. And
Yeah.
then he was able to pass his GED in about 2 years. He just kept
Wow.
practicing and he was able to go in and pass the GED, and he didn't even ask for extra time. I told him he should, but he didn't. And so I was impressed. That's probably the fastest learner I've ever worked with.
Yeah, well, if you're really motivated, and and I think there's, they've done all the studies now about emotional sensitivity and young dyslexic students, and I feel like in many cases, especially when we kind of put some of these kids in this pressure cooker environment, they recognize they're different. They don't want to impose on people, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's just this, it's this mixture that makes it difficult. Even if someone wants to sit down with you and work with you on reading, it's some of it might be shame, but also some of it is just, I just want to be able to do this myself. And so if we've got something that's infinitely patient, that can be adjusted in the right speed, beautiful. It's just beautiful. And, and it's not something I was telling you, oh, you only got 30% right, fail, it's not all this message. It's just like, I am trying to learn here, which is a beautiful thing, and I just need to be put in contact with this kind of things. Now, at the same time, I realize there are a lot of people, because of this kind of emotional component, they actually like to work with a tutor because they know that that's a person on the other side who's rooting for me, who I can ask any question of, and things like that. But it's different. It's different strokes for different folks. And some people, especially as they get a little older, they just want to be put in contact with the tools and then drop in back if they need more help, or try to figure out what's going on to troubleshoot something. So I think that's just that's a wonderful example. And I think we need to have more of that. I think the problem is that people worry about, well, if you have to pay for something or it's proprietary or something like that, they don't have that as part of a standard, IEP 504. There's nothing saying you should teach basic technology so you can access the information you need. They have, there's things that are not that expensive now, and they're also free tools, but it's not part of training. And teachers may vary widely in terms of how tech savvy they are, and so that aspect of it is still, it's this gaping hole. They should pass a law about accessibility that involves connecting people with tools. There are just so many that are out there now that can really help people. But there are also challenges if you're completely tech newbie, novice, that you really do need some step-by-step instruction. You need patience, and sometimes customization of tools. In the desire to have a clean layout, they also hide a lot of these tools, or they have a couple of steps, which makes things very difficult. And so, and depending on what device you have, and then they keep changing the systems, I understand why it's difficult, but the payoff is really significant down the line. And so, I mean, it's great to hear that you actually are, very at ease at being able to connect with technology as well as to attend to other kinds of tutoring needs. So I think that's really very nice.
Well, maybe one important point is that using audiobooks, and especially audiobooks plus tracking, that is not to denigrate the use of phonics or teaching basic phonemic awareness. What I like to do is start with phonics, make sure the student has that basic idea. That may or may not be the tool that they end up using most, but they do need, like you said, the basic ability to sound out a word if they have to. So that needs to be in place. And I like to do that first, but not push it to the point where for years and years and years, you've got 15-year-old kids who are still sounding out words. That does not make them feel successful or happy about reading.
I know. We've been surprised about that. We've been surprised when we've actually met people who are in order, and the fact that it's not spoken about either is a mistake, And so we've definitely had some people, because I think there can be fears on all the different sides. There can be fears that if you don't, by the decoders, that when you go into fluency, there's some people who are misled that only fluency would be fine for intervening for dyslexic students. And that's not the case, right? That's not the case. That reading fluency practice is just going to help with decoding things magically. That's not going to happen. But there's also a lot of ways to be successful. And, it is true. It's, you will get some proponents who will never discharge anyone from Gordon Gilliam, they will never say it's a little bit, I don't know if it's just like, orthodontics, an orthodontist who will never tell you to stop wearing your retainer. I mean, there's some things like that. And, you can sort of see why they say that, you know what I mean? But at some point, someone's just going to say, no, I don't know, I'm 45, I'm not going to wear a retainer. I mean, there's some level where, the students may say, this is enough. I've done a couple years of this now. I can actually decode pretty well. And when I can't, I have a a workaround that allows me to figure out the word. And, obviously you can also pop the word into Google, or you can put it into Microsoft OneNote and have it broken out in syllables and hear the correct pronunciation. There's ways to actually figure out those words, and if you're going to go into, comparative literature or something like that, you might want to have your phonological, abilities even stronger, because that's what you're going to be doing primarily. But for a lot of people that, they might get to this point where this is enough. Now I want to get to the fluency part. So I'm not behind in all my classes because I can't do what I want to do. And, especially if these things are like STEM fields, spatially inclined, it's not going to be, it'll be somewhat an issue with reading and writing, but not to the extent that other domains will necessarily be. And everyone's different. There are some people who just see that they're getting better and better, and they want to keep with it. So, and there's a lot of parents, it's expensive, and so push comes to shove, they're going to have to figure out where they're going to end up tailing that off and then putting something back in. But it's also remiss to not discuss this aspect of it, of not caring about speed and only learning and decoding. Because if you've got 10 years of a young person's life where they're never going at speed, never going at speed with their eyes and tracking and, then they're going to have more problems later on when they really want to become fluent readers. And so this aspect of it, it all fits together. It is not only a visual problem. There can be a visual component, it's not only fluency, it's not it's not only phonological awareness, it's really all of them put together. And then there's that human being who's an emotional, sensitive person. You've got to kind of figure out what's the next best step, and that might really change where they are, what their surroundings are, and expectations are. So, I think that's great that you've been able to kind of guide people at a point where it's really critical for them. So,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's a huge part of successful tutoring or teaching is assessing where is that student emotionally in relation to reading, and what can we do to make this a happy thing for them, whatever that takes. Because if it's painful, they'll avoid it. Of course, we all do. And if it's happy and they're learning things, and kids who are learning things are generally happy about it.
it's true.
And so if you see the kid getting excited and feeling like I'm making progress, I'm learning stuff, this is fun, then you're winning.
Yeah.
And audiobooks are a big part of that. And also another thing you mentioned that I want to highlight, because I think it's so important, is the economic issue. I was a dyslexia tutor. I loved it. I got to see kids learn to read. It was very exciting. And I wouldn't want to do anything else. It's, it makes me very happy. But in order to make a living at that, I had to charge more than some parents could afford. And there was only a limited number of pro bono cases I could take and still survive economically. So that's a very real issue, accessibility because of economics. And this is where audiobooks and libraries are essential and absolutely life-changing. So once I could show a student that they could go in a public library and they could check out a book and an audio recording of the same book, and they could access that book in that way for free, it opened the world to them. I've had students who just started going down the all of the science and technology books in the local library and just devouring them.
Yeah.
And another way that it's not exactly audiobooks, but it's the same technique, is like science documentaries with the subtitles turned on.
That's right.
You're seeing and hearing the words at the same time, gaining that scientific vocabulary. It's totally a game changer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Libby app. I love the Libby app. The fact that there's audiobooks through there too, I mean, so things are better and better, and you don't even, you don't even have to go physically in the library. Now, some people really do prefer a print book and the audio. So I realize that. But when you get a little bit beyond, sometimes people really will do just fine with like an Overdrive Media audiobook where it highlights every word. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I think all these kind of things are just really wonderful. And it's important for, because we do get contacted a great deal by dyslexic adults who are trying to figure out where to start. And the cost for tutoring is difficult, for many people. So we do mention things like, askgen.org, which sometimes will have funds available. It's paid for by the American federal government. So they'll have grants for a little bit of technology, or have a little bit of grants for coaching. And, if it's a parent who really wants to help, but can't afford tutoring, well, there's a couple different things. If your student is really failing in school, sometimes the school will have funds for so-called high impact tutoring, so that's a possibility. But also we've also met a lot of mommies who become like mommy PhD, and they just, I can read, I've got to find some way to do it. And some curriculum are set up for that. So, and you can say, well, it might be more efficient with a tutor. Yeah. But if you can't, if you can't do it, or, sometimes these parents might be able to, like in your situation, like you might be able to have a couple sessions to actually help inform them and then they're on their way, and much better than if they had no one at all. So, I mean, I think that's the thing. It's you start where you are, and, you try to use whatever inexpensive and free resources are available. And then, starting is better than not starting at all. So, because the returns are tremendous. So, that's a great example that you bring up.
Yeah, that's very true. And I did a lot of work with families where I knew they couldn't afford to keep coming, but they could come for a month or two. And I would have the parents sit in on the sessions and observe me working with the students so that they could kind of absorb a different way of approaching reading, because so many of the parents were getting the homework from the teacher and they're supposed to force the child to read for 20 minutes, or they're supposed to force the child to read so many pages. And it became a very unhappy battle, tears, crying, and, just anxiety and fear and all the bad stuff you don't want paired with reading was going on. And so the audiobooks, again, to the rescue, because an audiobook does not sound exasperated.
It's true. Yeah, that's right.
An audiobook can be repeated innumerable times without anyone losing their patience, especially with headphones.
Yeah, exactly
So,
right. It's true. I know. And sometimes, like, so there are these things, decodable readers, obviously, and there's high-low books, which is another thing where you've got high-level content, but easier to read, to try to get them where they are. But even some things, like, it can, just morale-wise, you can give them, like, a joke book that they can put into text to speech, and that would be enjoyable, right, for the right kid, rather than
Right.
something that's, that's a little bit more prosaic in terms of decodable readers. So, having a little bit of sense of humor, and also having content that meets them where they are. I mean, if you get a youngster who's really into horses, and you get the horse book that they've been dying, Pony Pals or something they've been dying to read, and you put it together with audio and a print book, it's a winning combination, because they want to know that they want to read the book. That's the key. So
One thing I always ask my students right off the bat is, what do you wish you could read? And we go
great
from
question.
there.
Yay.
Yeah.
To learn more about dyslexia, sign up for a free monthly newsletter and visit us at dyslexicadvantage.org.